So having been so forward-looking and challenging and innovative and nimble and flexible, we're now going to switch to a discussion on policy. So I would just ask our two other panel members to join me on stage. Brian Cahill, who's the Managing Director of Moody's Investor Services, and also Peter Costellas, who's the CEO of the Carbon Market Institute. And while they're coming up on stage, we're just going to show a quick video just to provide a little bit of an insight from our American colleagues in terms of how investors are responding to the changing investor landscape in the US. So we might just quickly roll the video. Thanks.
The United States will withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord.
The business community has a strong reaction to the president's withdrawal from the Paris Agreement. Many prominent companies, including IBM, ExxonMobil, and Amazon, support the accord.
More than 24 companies, including oil giant Shell, Apple, Facebook.
General Electric CEO Jeff Immelt tweeted, quote, "Climate change is real. Industry must now lead and not depend on government."
It was just an enormous response of businesses saying, unlike 10 years ago, they're willing to step up to the plate, they're willing to be part of the solution, not part of the problem, and they're willing to act. This is not about good guys versus bad guys, East Coast versus West Coast, blue states versus green states. It is about whether or not we have enough jobs. It is about whether our industries stay strong. The agricultural industry can't be strong if climate keeps getting worse and storms are ruining their crops. The insurance industry will not stay strong if they're paying $40 billion in payouts on average a year for the property and casualty insurance sector because of climate-related increased storms. The clothing industry, who rely on the cotton crop, do not do well when the cotton crop dies due to droughts caused by climate change. What we found was not 10 companies or 20 companies, but 50 companies and then 100 companies, and we're now at 500 plus, who wanted to stand up and make the case that acting on climate was in their own self-interest as well as in the public interest. For us, it's bringing in some who people felt would be against climate regulation, who people felt in the past opposed climate regulation, but we're seeing quite the opposite, that businesses understand the need to act. They're starting to act, and from all the most unsuspecting places. And if Washington doesn't want to listen to environmental leaders or scientists, they will listen to the major corporate leaders and financial leaders when they call for change, and change now.
I prove my tech credentials by Skyping in Anne Simpson from Cowpers.
Hello.
Hello, Anne. It's Emma here. Can you hear us?
Yes, no, I can hear you loud and clear.
Excellent.
Miracles of modern technology.
I just want to make a couple of quick observations. We know that the policy and the politics of climate change have always been challenging, whether we're looking at how we actually drive and form up and agree an international framework, but that we actually did it. We have done it in terms of the Paris Agreement, and the challenge is now implementation. If I look across the region, we know that for the last 20 years we've been talking about how many developing economies and emerging economies would have difficulties in terms of signing up to a climate change agreement. But in actual fact, what we're seeing now is that it is many of those economies who are driving innovation in terms of climate change and who are putting in place national policy frameworks to respond to climate change. So when we turn to Australia and New Zealand, I think it's important to note that yes, we are in a challenging position now in terms of getting an agreement around climate change, but that actually the level of the debate that we're having and the involvement and the position of the participants has changed so radically that it's important not to get too pessimistic in terms of our ability to actually come to an agreement in Australia. And again, if we look at the continuing challenges of the international discussion as well, to understand that even with Trump, and as we just saw from the series video around the role and the response of investors and business, that there is still significant and major momentum in terms of investors and the finance and the private sector community in terms of contributing to and driving a conducive and supportive policy environment. So that's my very glass half full opening introduction to the policy session. So I think we've got a great panel here today. We've got Anne Simpson, who's the Investment Director from CalPERS, who's on the phone. We've got Brian Cahill, who's the Managing Director for Moody's Investment Services, and Peter Costellas, as I said, who's the CEO of the Carbon Market Institute. So I guess I want to start by asking each of you just to provide some brief comments, just to sort of set out your initial thinking in terms of where we are today and some of the challenges you're facing. And Brian, I might start with you, and then Anne, I'll come to you, and then come back to you, Peter. I think that's probably a good order to go in. So Brian, if I can just ask you to make some brief opening comments.
Sure. Thank you, Emma. So actually I'd reaffirm a lot of what you've just said, because obviously the debate in Australia can be pretty depressing if you focus on that on its own. But if you look globally, I'd say the decarbonisation policy agenda has changed dramatically in the last 2 years. The dialogue has, I think, changed at both a political and an investor and a corporate perspective since Paris, and that's only 2 years ago. So you see that the direction of travel around decarbonisation, I think, is clear and accepted. We have a significant issue around pace, but the direction is very, very clear now. And if you look at some of the major markets, the EU, China, India, they're making very significant moves that are transforming sectors. Power sector is obviously transforming globally. But if you look at the dialogue around the auto sector in the last 12 months and some of the policy statements that have been made, it's very clear that that sector is now about to undergo a very dramatic change that even 18 months ago people would have questioned. But you've got both the UK, and France committing to ending petrol sales by 2040. You've got China rumoured to be announcing something around about 2030. You've got India saying the same. Now, the policy hasn't been implemented yet, but the statements are there. So I think at a high level you can see very clear policy statements and commitments that are very encouraging, and that is changing the dialogue at all levels, whether that's at the government level, at the investor level, or at the corporate level. Subnational policies are supporting those initiatives where national policies are not so supportive. So you're seeing that both here and in the US, where states and cities are committing to decarbonisation agendas within their own power. We had the government minister from Victoria yesterday reaffirming their net zero commitment by 2050. That's a very powerful statement. It's mirrored by other states within Australia at a subnational level. We see similar things going on, obviously, in the States, particularly out of California. The C40 Cities Initiative, if you're not aware of that, both Sydney and Melbourne are signatories to that. Again, commitments at a city level to work towards decarbonising cities in a way that's consistent with a 2-degree world. So you've got both national and subnational policies that are working in a constructive, long-sighted way that are very powerful enablers. And then you have coalitions of businesses, civil society, investors reinforcing that. We had IDCC here. We have Sarah's the video we just saw. We've got science-based target commitments. 310 companies now have committed to science-based targets. Those are some very large companies in there. Honda, Nissan, Walmart. They're all committing to decarbonising in a scientifically committed and proven way. And then I think, just staying on this for one final second, prudential supervision is coming very clearly. I mean, the FSB is not a disclosure task force, it's a prudential supervision financial stability board, and they created the task force to shine a light on something that they are concerned about. And I don't think it's any surprise that subsequent to that central regulators of banks such as APRA and the Bank of England have stated very publicly that they'll be looking at ways to stress test portfolios around it. So you can see government policies, you can see regulatory policies all going in the same direction. And then probably the last thing I would say is that if you broaden it out just away from climate change, you also see some very interesting sustainability policy initiatives occurring, which are looking to incorporate sustainability issues in a broad way into the financial system. We heard yesterday from Professor Hong at ICBC about what they're doing in reaction, essentially, to the Chinese government's very comprehensive reform package around incorporating sustainability issues into their financial system. That's early stages, but clearly is going to take that country in a very different way. You've got the high-level expert group in the EU providing guidance to the EU Commission on how to incorporate sustainability into the financial system in the EU. A final report due by the end of the year. So I think if you look at all of this in its context, you can see a very clear and positive message that, if you sit here, sometimes gets lost.
Great, thank you. Anne, I might jump to you at this point, just in terms of what you're seeing from both, I guess, your position in the US, but also across some of the other broader global markets that CalPERS are very active in as well.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Emma. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, you're coming through loud and clear.
Oh, terrific. Well, the first thing, we're so pleased and proud to be working with IGCC and AIGCC, and I think the fact that we're having this global dialogue is a sign of exactly what both you and Brian have commented upon, that we're at a turning point from a series of scattered efforts and initiatives into a new direction of travel, in which I think we have economic forces reflecting the science, which has been well understood for some time. And I think the role of the financial market is now driving the pace of change in many areas. So I think very important to note that the policy framework is important. CalPERS is a strong supporter of the Paris Agreement. We were there. We were part of the Global Investor Coalition, which both of these organizations I've just mentioned today, who are hosting this discussion, were there. And something in the order of close to $25 trillion US, signed a statement saying, we need a strong agreement. We also want, measures like carbon taxes. We want this externality to be priced. In other words, we want the policy levers to be pulled in order that we start dealing with market distortions. So, for example, not only carbon pricing, but also asking for subsidies to fossil fuel to be removed. So we know that the Paris targets are very important, but they also have an important feature, I think, for every region, which is that I think the beauty of the design is that the nationally determined contributions are bottom up. It's not experts in a basement, which is a little how it was perhaps in Copenhagen, deciding on what needed to be done. I think the process of inclusion and engagement and discussion to generate nationally determined contributions to the overall plan was extremely important. Now, what matters, I think, in the policy, although these were agreements that rolled into Paris at a national level, as you will have just seen in the series video, two powerful forces are running alongside and actually ahead of some of the national commitments. So let's look at the United States as an example. Through the measures where cities and states are signing up to be committed, CalPERS is an example. Our chief executive signed the statement to say we're still in. You've now got this interesting alliance of subnational governments, which are extremely important economically, sort of in tandem with where the financial markets are going. And I think CalPERS is a pretty good example of that. So now you all know what's going on in California. There's a huge amount of innovation and technology. We've got the headquarters of new companies like Tesla. We have the state legislature has just renewed the cap and trade scheme, and California will be hosting its very own climate summit next year. So I think what we're seeing is that the local and state actors are taking matters into their own hands, which is very important. And what you're seeing, which backs this up and reflects it and accelerates it in the financial community, is investors starting to appreciate two dimensions. One is climate risk, which is very much the bank's supervisory agenda of the Financial Stability Board, as Brian rightly mentioned, but also what we're looking at as investors are the opportunities. Because we're not only going to be exposed to the risks from climate. If you look at the storms that have wrought such devastation in Puerto Rico, Texas, Florida, in the United States, and parts of the Caribbean, it's all too obvious that there is physical impact, which is being exacerbated in this case. The severity of storms is being exacerbated through the warming of the body of ocean water. There are many other physical effects that are going to be important, and we at CalPERS have started to examine those. For example, looking at, well, what will be the impact of extreme temperature increase, the impact on migration? What's that going to do if you own office buildings or infrastructure, or even just to the local economies of areas that are going to be badly affected? So we have to start mapping climate risk. That's clear, and that I think is now being understood as an investment issue. And on the opportunity side, I think what we see in this transition is we are all, as pension funds, looking at the very long term with the need to earn significant amounts in order to pay pensions. That's actually just our fiduciary duty summed up, to make sure we can pay benefits as and when they fall due. So the opportunity side of this transition in the Paris Agreement is something that's very interesting and potentially attractive to investors. So just as an example, I think on our side is what CalPERS has done is integrate climate risk and climate opportunity as themes in our investment beliefs, in our principles, and more recently in our own strategic plan. We've developed a 5-year strategic plan for the total fund, which is one of the largest funds in the world. It's a $330 billion fund invested globally, as Emma mentioned. So our intention, our objective is to be good stewards, good fiduciaries, and make sure that we are taking account of climate risk and opportunity in all asset classes across the whole portfolio. And you can read more about that strategic plan on our website if you want to find out the details. The other thing I think that I would say is that it's not just the very big long-term asset owners like CalPERS who are taking these issues up. We've seen mainstream fund managers start to speak out and acknowledge climate risk. BlackRock is an example. They're the largest aggregator of assets in the world, over $4 trillion under management, but also leading groups like State Street and so forth in the United States. And what's happened that's extremely important this year is we've seen the European work to introduce requests for climate risk reporting by companies being brought to the vote and being won at big companies like BP and Shell. But this year we won through tremendous coordination and collective effort between investors led by the US, supported by the Europeans, at Exxon, at Occidental, at utilities like PPL. And this was in the face, or I should say, maybe in the teeth of management advice from those companies to say, no, we don't think we should do this, we don't think we could do this, but the financial markets are pushing this into the, we not just request, we require that this type of reporting be brought forward. And I think that is really echoing what's coming through the supervisory requests, through the FSB, and also we're seeing more local examples to you, like BHP Billiton, who led the way with, the first round of scenario reporting. This is also starting to affect the way that investors are talking about the directors who are on boards. We've seen BHP appointing a climate scientist, Dr. Fiona Wild, to support the board. She participated on the task force the FSB set up. Exxon, the largest oil company in the world, has put a climate scientist onto the board in the form of Dr. Susan Avery. And this conversation about, climate competent boards is, if you like, the to-do list, the practical implementation of what it means to be climate savvy as an investor. So this has given the power to the policy agenda which I think has been lacking until now. And then just at the Principles for Responsible Investment, PRI in person in Berlin, just a week or so ago, we launched a call to action with IGCC and AIGCC to call on investors to join us in an initiative called the Climate Action 100 Plus. You can look that up, Google it, and find the website if you're interested in finding out more. Because what we're looking at doing is bringing together investors in order to tackle what we are calling the systemically important carbon emitters. So we think the tide is running fast on the policy front, on the supervisory front, and the financial markets can either profit or lose in the process, but we need, as the owners of these companies, to be able to speak up. So a strong policy framework is really important, but it doesn't mean that we can avoid taking up our own responsibilities to be good fiduciaries, and that means looking at the risk and the return. So I think the message I would close with is that this partnership between public policy and private sector action is powerful, and one will not be successful without the other. We can't regulate our way to a solution, to a low-carbon economy, but at the same time, what you'll also find is that the financial markets adapt quickly, they're innovative, and increasingly, through the mainstream, all of this thinking and ideas and innovation in finance are moving from being trickles to being the mainstream. And so, to echo Emma, I would actually go a little beyond the glass half full. I wouldn't say the glass is brim full, but certainly I think there's been tremendous and significant and very encouraging progress. So I think Asia is playing an extremely important role. The Green Finance Task Force, led by the People's Bank of China and others in China when China had the G20 presidency, is just an example of global leadership on the topic that we all benefit from. So we do need to keep our eyes on the prize and understand that these are some irreversible trends in the physical economy which we inhabit, and finance, finance meeting, if you like, finance meets physics is a powerful combination. Mm-hmm. So I am certainly seeing tremendous progress, which is very encouraging. Okay. So thank you.
Great. Thanks, Anne, for those comments. Peter, if I can turn to you in terms of what we're seeing on two aspects. I mean, one in terms of emerging regulatory frameworks across the Asia-Pacific region, but then also just some opening comments on Australia in the last 24 hours.
Yeah, thanks Emma, and thanks for inviting us, and for you and your team for organising a great event in a great city on a beautiful day. Firstly, I think the overarching policy environment that we're operating in, business and finance, is dictated, I think, largely by some of the developments that we'll see as a legacy of the Paris Agreement. In Paris a couple of years ago, it's been mentioned a number of times today and yesterday, that it was such a significant diplomatic triumph where the world came together and actually agreed to send what I think is really the mother of all market signals that the global emissions trajectory is down. The President of the United States at the time, not the one that was shown there, but the one at the time, President Obama said, "This is we're the first generation to feel the effects of climate change, in the last generation that can do something about it." And I think there was a galvanisation there that I wouldn't underestimate the power of the input of, like the investor groups on climate change, like the business coalitions that were there. There's very strong representation that's been maintained. If you fast forward a year later to the Conference of Parties in Marrakesh, halfway through what was quite a celebratory week because the Paris Agreement had been ratified in unprecedented time, came the national election in the United States, and President Trump was elected. So it sent shockwaves through the gathered delegates. What does that mean, particularly for the US delegates who were there at the time? But interestingly, over the course of the following week, once the shock of that started to settle in, there was a galvanisation again that the agreement is solid, it's unstoppable. The recommitment for people and the empowerment that sort of come out of that, I think we haven't seen any country indicate that they also would leave the agreement. I think that's pretty significant because what that does, it sets the framework for the action, for the implementation of the rulebook, which is really what the discussions are going on now. The president of the Conference of Parties is is the Prime Minister of Fiji for this coming Conference of Parties in Bonn in next month. He's set the agenda, which I think is really indicative of where some of the opportunities lie, but also where the policy environment's going to go. And those key agenda items that he wants to bring as the president of the COP one is to increase ambition. So 2 degrees is not enough. He's in a low-lying Pacific Island state where his neighbours like Tuvalu, Kiribati, Marshall Islands, etc., are really feeling the brunt of sea level rise and extreme weather events. Increasing ambition, financing adaptation to actually put the structures and mechanisms in place to address climate resilience in economies around the world, financing renewable energy and that energy transition, and the development of markets. And that the rule book that's being written, I think, is really important as the implementation framework for how these different modes are going to operate. And it's incumbent, I think, on Australian business and government to have a seat at the table as these rules are being written. And it is somewhat surprising that there's a lack of interest in some of, let's say, our major business associations, whatever, who aren't involved or engaged in the process at the moment of how these rules can be written and what that means for Australia. And if you take one key component of that, which is how the market provisions of the Paris Agreement will play out, which is Article 6 in the technical version, it'll dictate how trade will take place across borders in not just carbon units as they may be defined as they were under the Kyoto mechanisms, with a UN-governed approach to trade and a global governance approach, but also one track of the way markets will evolve is how mitigation transfers are going to be undertaken across borders and the bilateral arrangements that could be put in place and the flexibility for countries to establish relationships with other countries to look at ways of meeting emissions reductions at lowest cost by connecting through technology transfer and financing, institutional strengthening, sharing of emission reduction methods. Those kind of models are being actively pursued by countries like Japan and Korea and China, who are establishing under their own sort of initiatives what is being called carbon clubs, how you can actually look at establishing trade aid and diplomatic relations across borders to be able to affect emissions reduction cost at lowest cost to the economy by being able to trade across borders. And these are the kind of developments that are leading to some real investment in new types of business models, but importantly collaborations and cooperations. And at the moment, I think it's fair to say that our Australian government, although the DFAT representatives are highly regarded and do a great job when they go and represent Australia, our sort of national policy is not really focused on what we need to do to optimise our position in the international carbon markets and climate policy developments that are taking place in our region. And so just briefly, some of those developments which I think are really critical, which clearly China is probably the biggest player on the block. I mean, we often would say, you know, China's our biggest trading partner, but it is the biggest trading partner of every country in the region, and other countries are actually in there working with China on this low carbon development.
Surely we have a special relationship, Peter.
We have a special relationship, yeah, and I think that was because, you know, our Prime Minister spoke Mandarin in the previous time. But you know, some of the developments that are happening there indicate that, I mean, it is, you know, it's not just driven by the Paris Agreement, clearly, although the Premier has really been strong to unequivocally say that China will continue to be part of the agreement, and it's important that all parties are as well. But is, you know, as many of you know, you can't breathe the air in cities like Beijing and Shanghai at certain times of the year. So there's a real driver to address the pollution and the atmospheric content of greenhouse gases. But some of those significant things, one of the more significant things is that China will be launching a national emissions trading scheme. Our understanding is next month at the Bonn Conference of Parties. It will be a massive carbon trading scheme, which will put will cover, from our understanding, where the design is about 5 billion tonnes, about 7,000 companies. It'll be phased in, so it won't be a dramatic conversion, but it will be a cap and trade model where they will actually progressively reduce the emissions of the economy of the covered entities. And when you look at the size of that, what it does, it'll really shift the gravity of carbon pricing to our region in the same way infrastructure development and manufacturing, you know, is sort of being shifted to China. So will carbon pricing, and that will have a direct flow-on effect to particularly Australian energy-intensive exporters who we sit directly in the supply chain. And if you reverse what happened when Australia had a national carbon pricing mechanism, those heady days for a couple of years where we actually had an economy-wide carbon price, what did companies do when that were covered by the carbon price? They looked at their supply chain, they looked at the energy intensity coming through, they made decisions about procurement and about how much they were accounting for the costs of carbon in terms of pass-throughs. That's going to be replicated by the private sector and state-owned enterprises in China who buy from Australian goods and services. So to be aware that that shift in carbon pricing will put a price in the system, will have a flow-on effect to our energy-intensive exporters is really critical. So what is the exposure to that, I think, is important. When you then look at the two other major economies in our region and the policies they put in place, India and Indonesia, which doesn't get talked about a lot, have also made very significant commitments under the Paris Agreement. Interestingly, they're both democracies. They're not dictatorships. And those democracies, I had dinner at a Chinese restaurant with a few visiting Indian MPs a couple of months ago, and they're all from representatives of different parties, and they're all completely on board with the climate policies of Modi. They need to actually put those in place. They're looking at scaling up decentralised energy generation and that business model innovation that will come with it. They're looking at planting trees to the equivalent of 2.5 to 3 billion tonnes of carbon sequestration. The policies they're putting in place around that relate back to the central government in their annual budget allocation. They give a premium to states, almost like their GST carve-up, depending on a baseline of how many trees they've planted in their states. These countries are serious. Indonesia, which is the fourth largest emitter in the world and the fourth largest population and third largest emitter, has a massive challenge but is committed to 29% emissions reduction. So all of that's happening in our region. So what are we doing? Our policy environment at the moment is fairly stagnant. Clearly, the politics of Australia, as everyone in this room knows, is a little bit dysfunctional. But that doesn't actually help address the fact that our policy commitment into Paris, our commitment to the international reductions commitment, doesn't match the policy suite we've got in place at the moment to implement that. So the understanding for businesses who have got a reasonably good corporate memory know that, that there is going to be a change and a tightening of domestic policies. In absence of a clean energy target, which our great former Prime Minister announced in London overnight that he really advocates we should walk away from the clean energy target. We've got ministers of the government actually indicating that might be the case. It's one part of the policy suite that needs to be locked in. But if it's not, then what does that mean for other parts of the economy that are going to have to carry the emissions reduction burden? And that puts the pressure on those who are currently covered by the safeguard mechanism. So 350 facilities in Australia have a baseline over them that if they exceed that baseline, they have to purchase emissions to stay below that. At the moment, those baselines are set so incredibly high that it's a very, very, very light touch. And there's not many chances that there'll be an emissions exceedance. However, the Clean Energy Regulator, a meeting we had last week, said that they think that there might be some emissions exceedance in this first period, which is at the end of October when the National Energy and Greenhouse reporting numbers are calculated. So what does that mean? It means that there's going to be a focus on the fact that there is a liability that's real, that even this government's policy suite does cover companies, that there's not a lot of attention being paid to the fact that if those baselines, which is really the only policy lever in this current policy suite that they can tighten to start meeting our below business as usual emissions reduction, if that starts to tighten, then companies have an unknown liability and, importantly, a shortage of domestic credits, which are all being purchased under contract to the government to be able to meet that liability. So the cost for compliance, if there is a need for a company to purchase units in between October and February when there's a true-up period next year, where are they going to get them from? They're all being currently under the ERF being sold to the government under contract. If they were to buy them in the secondary market, they're going to have to buy them at premium. It's a higher price than the government has. There's no policy in place to allow the use of international units. Not that we think there's going to be availability and cheap supply in a post-2020 period anyway. So it puts this big question mark now on what is the liability of the Australian companies are going to have to face under a policy environment that we know is going to change.
All right, there was a lot there. I'm just going to quickly dial Anne back in and just recap all of that, what Peter just said quickly for her. No, I'm kidding. Brian, what I might do while we're dialing back in Anne, I just want to, I'll just jump to you in terms of just picking up on a couple of those themes that we've heard in our opening comments. And I guess I just want to talk a little bit about, this disconnect that we're seeing in terms of the actual discussion around policy and then the...
Hello, this is Anne Simpson. Please leave me a message.
I might get Rebecca to drive that while we're doing it. Brian, let me start again with that question. We're seeing this disconnect between the actual, the subnational, the business, the investor, the emerging regional market response. And we've got this overarching framework of the Paris Agreement. You've still got a somewhat patchy network of national sort of market or national regulatory responses. How are you seeing companies and investors kind of navigate their way through the middle of that gap between the international and the subnational and the national? Like, what are some of the things that companies are doing to actually manage those issues and those implications?
Well, maybe I'll talk about it from our perspective, right? And I'd first of all start by saying it's complicated. Right? That's the first thing that is very obvious, is that at one level you can make a decision about what you think the emissions pathway may look like based on Paris or 2 degrees. That gives you a global pathway that then once you push down to sectors starts becoming more complicated again, and then if you think about sectors in certain national jurisdictions becomes even more complicated. So I don't think it's straightforward at all. I think that's why you end up, frankly, with investment strikes such as you're having here, is because no one can accurately foresee what is going to happen, but they can see where things are going to be in terms of pressures. So our own perspective is that we've started to create frameworks that will give us, if you like, a starting point for us to assess the implications of this for the most exposed sectors. Not that dissimilar to others that have been created. IGCC have created one, and that's just allowing us to think about, well, okay, how is this going to translate into pressures into the auto sector or the oil and gas sector or the power sector? We're working on building materials right now. Regulated utilities are about to come out. Interesting, based on the conversation that we had in the previous panel. So we are creating these frameworks that allow us to think about what are the transmission mechanisms, how will they translate into impacts into individual sectors, how will we then translate that into impacts at individual entities, and what does that then mean for us from a credit rating perspective, which is a whole different issue. And as you get into it, you realise it's very, very complicated, and you have to take your time. There's great data about emissions. There's not a lot of great data about forward-looking views from companies about emissions. Task Force may well help with that. But that's at a high level how we think about it.
Yeah. And what about some of those themes that Peter was talking about in terms of regional developments? I know that you also look across the Asia Pacific. I mean, how influential is China's actions and its current stance actually being in terms of the corporate response and the regional response as well?
I think it depends on the industry, right? But if you have any exposure to China in relation to carbon, it's very, very influential, whether that's because you're in the supply chain or whether you are a major auto manufacturer, for example, or you are trying to estimate the likely long-run cost of renewables, given that China's now installing, 55 gigawatts a year of renewables, and India's at, I think, current run rate about 14 gigawatts of renewables. So you can see that they are driving down costs in certain core areas, and they are driving policy that is going to influence globally, not just regionally. And you have to, accept that that is a major economy that is moving ahead with some very significant policy initiatives, and you have to get a grip with what that means for your particular sector.
Peter, if I can jump back to you, so much of the policy discussion in Australia this year has been focused specifically on energy, justifiably. Mm-hmm. But as you sort of set out, there are actually a number of existing regulatory mechanisms in place that begin to actually come into effect this year. For example, the safeguard mechanism, and then also the ongoing uncertainty around the emission reduction fund and what happens next in terms of funding allocation. Do you get a sense that there is, or we are about to go into a period where there is a much greater appreciation of the impact of what policy mechanisms are in place, in addition to the discussion and the debate around something like a clean energy target?
Yeah, I think so, Emma. I think there's a really active conversation going on inside corporates at the moment, and it's usually probably maybe one or two people down from the executive committee in terms of the direct report that's got the responsibility to say, what does all this mean for us?
Yeah.
What are we doing? What's our approach? What's our position? We have, like I think Anne mentioned, BHP has put some information out there. The banks have been, Australian banks have been really strong about putting positions out there and identifying what these issues mean. We've got a large bulk of, say, companies, representatives of all sectors who are now having that conversation internally, haven't gone out with their public position, but trying to understand that. And I think one of those things is where there is optimism for how the Australian government may move, whether it's this one, the next one, hopefully
Or the
not.
one 6 months later.
Yeah, the one 6 months later, is that there is a consistency in coming from industry. If you look at the 350 submissions to the Climate Policy Review, which mirror some of the positions in the Finkel Review submissions, which is we need to understand how the current suite is going to evolve. And so to understand that, I think then business is saying, well, when are we likely to have a liability and what is that going to be? And that's really hard to understand without the policy piece being clear.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Anne also mentioned, and I just want to pick up on this theme on the subnational versus the national versus the international. We seem to have Australia and the US seem to be mirroring each other in a somewhat unhealthy fashion in terms of the federal stepping up and then stepping back, and then the subnational or the state level stepping up in terms of policies. Is it a help or a hindrance to have a proliferation of state-based or local government authority regulatory regimes in place? Brian, I might start with you in that question.
Well, it would be much easier if you had one national policy that you had to analyse, because one of the complexities is there are multiple pathways that are going to, on which you might move forward on. You've got NDC commitments, you've got ratchet up mechanisms that mean that you should be moving towards something much greater than that over the next 5 to 10 years. And then you've got policy uncertainty about actually if it's going to get implemented at a national level. So if you had that straightforward, it would reduce the number of pathways you need to think about. Once you drop down from national uncertainty into subnational policy commitments, you then have to think about whether can those subnationals actually deliver on that, given the federal-state interaction or city-state interaction, and what does that mean in terms of a pace of change. So there's no doubt that it would be much better if the federal or the national government was stepping out very clear policies. Having said that, if you don't have it, I think what's very useful about the subnational statements is it makes very clear, again, if I come back to the point I made at the beginning, the direction of travel is very, very clear. And that's I think the problem that investors, rating agencies, businesses have is that you know where things are going to go, you just don't know the pace or pathways that's going to occur.
Yeah. Peter, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I think when you've got the size of an economy like California, it's a little bit different because you can actually ring fence that and set the benchmarks. And where Anne is, obviously there's been a history of decoupling emissions growth from economic growth in the state that can be attributed to some of the landmark Global Warming Act legislation. In Australia, I think we've seen now Queensland, Victoria, South Australia have all legislated zero net emissions targets by 2050. So that legislation has been put in place. It does provide a framework in absence of a national coordinated approach for businesses to look at where should they invest their business development. Where in Australia are we going to do the sort of piloting of electric vehicle infrastructure? Where is the battery technology? Where is the carbon farming? Where is the... So states have an opportunity, I think, to capture a part of the sort of spectrum of economic activities if they're clear about what they wanted to attract in their state. So South Australia's gone out that, and when Elon Musk was there a couple of weeks ago, with the battery there, they've got some market leading position there. So for the states and interaction with business in particular is can they under their policy commitment identify what kind of business they want to attract, and then work collaboratively with industry to do so. I think that's helpful, but I agree, Brian better thing, particularly in a small economy in terms of population like Australia. A national approach is so critical.
Yeah, right, okay. I want to open it up to, we're running a little bit over time, so I want to make sure that we have time for questions. Maybe one over here.
The provincial climate targets is something that is really more efficient and is working quite well. We've heard now from various speakers yesterday and today that a lot more really needs to happen, and I have a question going back to the ratcheting up mechanism that was just mentioned over here. With the US wavering and Australia not really knowing which way it wants to head, how realistic do you think that with everything that needs to be done, countries will actually manage to set even stricter targets, more ambitious targets in the next 5 to 10 years?
I mean, I think that we'd have to go back to the Paris Agreement, which was, similar questions have been asked, how do we actually get a global agreement, and can we frame it around 2 degrees? And then in the context of that week, there was a recognition that 2 degrees might not even be enough, even though the nationally determined contributions were indicating it's going to be a lot higher. So it will be international political pressure, really, I think. And so who's on the side? Who's sitting on the side of saying we need to ratchet up ambition? And we know that there's going to be China's going to be selling, so we know the EU is going to be on that side. So who lands on that side of the equation to follow through with the commitments to ratchet up ambition? And if so, then how does for example, our policy suite, we've got to factor in, even though, and the Finkel review didn't even do this, factor in the fact that it's 26 to 28% as a floor. We're going to have to go deeper over the ensuing decade. So I think planning for that is prudent. However, it will be Paris Mark II to see will there be enough of the grand coalition, which as I mentioned, the Fijian Prime Minister is looking at bringing that political pressure to bear by bringing non-state actors, so business and finance, into that coalition to actually increase the pressure, and all of the companies that are reflected in the opening video will stand on that side as well. So I think there will be that's one of the dynamics that will be playing out.
Okay, I'm conscious of the fact we're running over time, so I am going to unfortunately crunch down the audience question period. I'm just going to finish with one last question for both of you, without notice. Brian, 2 years since Paris, a huge amount has happened. Any care to make a prediction over the next 2 years in terms of the direction of travel and the speed of travel in terms of policy development?
Well, I think we're looking for implementation, right, of detailed policy implementation, and you continue to see that drip out. We're talking about China about to make an announcement, hopefully next month, about its emissions trading scheme. They're rumoured to be making some announcement very soon about auto emissions, which will be very significant. So I think you'll gradually see more and more policy statements coming out at the most important countries. If you think about the 4 regions that are most important, it's China, it's India, it's the EU, and it's the States. And what you've seen in the last 2 years is, I think, a surprise on the upside from India and China. Obviously a disappointment from the US, and then the EU, which has had a long track record of implementing climate change policies, continuing to press ahead and be more aggressive. So I don't have any particular predictions, but I think you should look at it in the round and say, yes, we have issues in the States, but elsewhere things are progressing pretty aggressively.
So can I summarise in terms of saying surprise on the upside in terms of implementation would be the key theme?
There's a good opportunity, right? Is if China announces that they will move to no petrol car sales by, let's say, 2040, that's the biggest car market in the world. That's a game changer. So that's a huge upside if that occurs.
Peter?
The Chinese government put in their nationally determined contribution that they'll peak emissions before 2030. Met with someone from the Chinese government recently, and they said that the numbers they're going to release in Bonn is that the peaking now will be between 2020 and 2021, and that they're going to put a plan in place to reduce that peak emissions by 2050 by 65%. So I think in the next 2 years, I think the game changer will be the confirmation of the economic opportunity and the direction that China is going in, and I think it's going to be substantiated with India. And so I'm glass half full, and then I take the glass and I turn it out and pour it on the table if I talk about the Australian position in the next couple of years, because I'm not confident in the way the politics are going, that there's going to be the strength with the current government to actually implement the policies required to meet that target. And if we have an election between now and in 2 years' time, which is where we're going, at this stage the opposition is going to bring their previous position to the table, and I think they're going to need a really strong support and messaging from Australian business and finance to give them confidence to go to the election with some. So it's a really important time in this next 2 years for that continuity of the voice, the strong voice from business and finance to act, to give our politicians any kind of confidence to go to the electorate.
Okay, well, I think we've successfully whipped through a huge amount of detail in terms of that, and I think that was really down to the quality of our speakers here today, and Anne in terms of the brief appearance that she was able to make as well. Unfortunately, technology was disrupted on this occasion in a not so futuristic way, but please join me in thanking Peter and Brian in terms of the panel. Thank you.